Our scripture reading today is from Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7, part of the Sermon on the Mount. And I want to take this reading as essentially a launching point for the message this morning. And in Matthew chapter 7, after a statement about judging, in verse 3 we read, "Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when there is a log in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye." May the Lord bless the reading of his word. This passage has been often misunderstood. In its connection with judging, people understand that it means don't judge at all, or don't seek to take the speck out of someone else's eye. And both of those interpretations are wrong. The statement in the previous two verses about judging essentially has the idea of being careful how we judge, because with the same measure, God will judge us. And so if we are to judge someone, it must be in a loving way in order to better them, to edify them, to build them up. People often miss the statement in the verses read this morning about, "Then you will be able to take the speck out of your brother's eye." In other words, the problem isn't with helping your brother, your sister remove the speck from their eyes, but it's being so hypocritical in your view of yourself. That's what is in view here. So he says, first, look at yourself. Judge yourself first. Notice that you are not only culpable, but to a greater degree than your brother or sister. And deal with yourself first, and then you will be able to help the other. Today, as we are kind of bookended by Valentine's Day and Family Day, I felt led to bring a message on marriage. A number of months ago, I had the privilege of bringing a short message at a wedding. And I brought a very abbreviated version of this message. And somebody said to me afterwards how they wish that somebody had told them these things when they got married many years before. And so this might be a good reminder for us of what God's purpose is for marriage and what the responsibilities are for both husbands and wives. Part of the reason for the scripture reading this morning is I want wives to pay very close attention to the Bible's instructions for them. I want husbands to pay very close attention to God's instructions for them. Because if a wife or a husband is to place blame upon their wife or to point out the speck in their wife or their husband's eyes, it's very important that first we get the log out of our own. Sometimes when we talk about what the role of husband or wife is, one of the spouses will instinctively want to make sure that the spouse hears their job, and they pay very little attention to what their responsibilities are. We usually want to blame the other for all the problems that comes in our marriages. Well, it's probably good that we begin where the Bible begins, and that is with God's original design. The Bible never defines marriage, it presents marriage. And we see this in Genesis chapter 2. In Genesis chapter 2, God has created the first man, and he brings all the animals before him, but it says that no suitable helper was found for the man. There is such a radical distinction in the Bible between animals and humans that there is no correspondence between the two. And so God decides that he would make a helper suitable for the man. And so that's exactly what he does. He puts the man to sleep, and he takes from the man's rib or from his side, and he fashions a woman from the side. The man's response is, "This is at last bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man." There's a play on words here. Ish is the word man. Isha is the word woman. Just as there's a play on the word for Adam, man. That's the word Adam, and the word ground, that he was formed from the dust of the earth, is the word Adamah. Now, verse 24 is the biblical presentation of marriage. "Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." Now, there are several important points that are made in this very, very short verse. The "therefore" is picking up what happened before, that there is no suitable helper for the man. And the word helper is not a term of inferiority. In fact, in the Bible, this word is used often of God. God is our helper. And we would all readily admit that the gap between us and God, the chasm between us and God, is infinite. There is, in no sense, is God inferior to us. But the helper has to do with a complement, somebody who is strong where we are weak, who makes up for where we lack. And so he sees that it is not good for the man to be alone. And it's not simply talking about loneliness. It's talking that God's design for the man is to live in community. He also told us in chapter 1, though, that part of this original design was procreation. God said to the man and the woman in chapter 1, verse 28, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." And so God makes male and female and unites them in this relationship that we call marriage. And one of the purposes for marriage is procreation. Now, in Genesis chapter 2, there are three basic concepts: leaving, holding fast or cleaving to, and one flesh. And just very briefly with these, the word leave, it says that the man shall leave his father and mother. Now, in the ancient world, leave does not mean move elsewhere. So this does not have the idea of the man, moving down the road or moving to the next province or the next city or anything like that. That is not the connotation here at all of this word leave. In the ancient world, generally, the man would either stay in his father's house, and there would be a room there for the man and his wife under their father, or an attachment would be made an addition to the house, or a separate dwelling place would be built on the property. So he's not physically going anywhere. So leaving doesn't have that idea of moving somewhere else. It's a relational term. In fact, the word leave often is translated in the Old Testament to forsake or abandon. Forsake is probably the best term, and it's using a bit of hyperbole, but it's emphasizing now the dynamic between this new relationship between the husband and the wife. That this relationship transcends the relationship that existed in a prior sense between father and son. Now, as a child, the strongest bond is between parent and child. That is the strongest relationship that the child has, the unmarried child. And so the Bible is saying that when the man enters into a new relationship with his wife, that is no longer the strongest relationship. Now the strongest relationship is not between parent-child, but between husband and wife. In fact, on the horizontal level, that is human-to-human relationship, the husband-wife relationship is the strongest, most binding, intimate relationship that exists. It is stronger than the bond between parent and child, and must necessarily be so scripturally. Often you've heard of the interfering in-laws. According to this passage, that cannot be allowed. That relationship, in some sense, has been severed. It's been changed, drastically so that the word used here is to forsake. So he enters into a new relationship that must supersede the previous relationship. So we must leave, forsake, abandon. The second term that is used is hold fast or cleave to his wife. The word cleave here is a word that usually refers to things being bound together. Hebrew lexica define it in terms of soldering something together, gluing something together. So there's a strong bond that happens between the husband and the wife. Job uses this term several times. He uses it, for instance, in Job 29, verse 10, of the tongue being stuck to the roof of the mouth. A much better example is in Job 19, verse 20, where he says that his bones stick to his skin and to his flesh. That's a pretty strong bond, right, between your flesh and your bones. And so this is the picture here that he cleaves, he sticks to, he's glued to his wife. They are bound together. Now, I think Jesus adds another layer to this, showing how strong the bond is intended to be. Because if you recall in Matthew chapter 19, where they're trying to lure Jesus in a discussion on divorce. And of course, Jesus tells them that they've got it all wrong. But one of the things he says is that what God has joined together, let no one separate. Now, it doesn't tell us in Genesis 2 that God is the actor who glues together, who binds together, but Jesus makes that very clear that it is God who joins, who glues together the husband and wife. And Jesus said that nobody has the right to unglue it, unbind it. That's why God says in Malachi that God hates divorce, because it is the separation of what God has joined. And the only reason why God permits it in certain rare occasions, Jesus tells us, is because of the hardness of heart, because of sin. But it's not designed to be that way. And so God is the tie that binds. God is the glue that holds together. God is the one who unites. So first of all, leave, forsake. Secondly, to cleave or unite or glue or solder together. And then finally, it says, and they shall become one flesh. One flesh. Now, this has been argued by some to refer to the sexual union between a husband and wife. And that is true. Biblically, that is to exist only within the bounds of marriage. Anything outside of that is sin. It is contrary to God's design. And we saw that in chapter 1 where God says, be fruitful and multiply. It's part of God's plan and purpose that there would be this action that leads to children in that union. But it's much more than that. One flesh has the idea of that you are so united in all matters that you are virtually inseparable. That the two are now one, building one life together. This, by the way, becomes corrupted. And I encourage you to go and read 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 3 through 5 in this area here, where even there Paul says that you do not belong to yourself, but to your spouse. And he reciprocates it, making sure that one side doesn't believe that they have that right and the other does not, but he intentionally singles out the husband and then the wife. So when God creates marriage, he creates it for several purposes: procreation, intimacy, relationship. All of this is part of God's good design, and it's part of the pre-fall world. So when God says at the end of all of creation, it is very good, it includes God's design for marriage. I should note, though, is that while the original creation had marriage, the new creation will not. Jesus tells us in response to a question in Matthew 22 that in the resurrection there is no marriage. We will be like the angels, neither marrying nor giving into marriage. Now, as far as application is concerned, I think Genesis chapter 3 is the most important thing. If you're going to get anything this morning in regard to marriage, it's Genesis chapter 3. Because one could only imagine what would have been, what could have been in the relationship between Adam and Eve without the fall, without sin. But with sin, their relationship became corrupted. And we see this in Genesis chapter 3, which records the fall of humanity into sin. The devastating consequences of sin affected not only Adam and Eve, but it affected their relationship with God and their relationship with one another. Remember, immediately we see it affect their relationship with God because they go and hide. They're afraid. Their relationship with God has now been distorted. It's been marred. It's been damaged. But their relationship with one another is also damaged. And we see this right away too. Because God approaches Adam, and Adam blames both God and the woman for what happened. He doesn't take any responsibility for his own willful disobedience and rebellion of God. Nobody made Adam eat the fruit. He chose to, of his own free volition. But Adam blames God. The woman you made. Don't miss that. In other words, God, it's your fault because you made the woman. If you hadn't made the woman, everything would have been great. What were you thinking, God? So he blames both. The woman doesn't blame the man, she blames the serpent. But there's an interesting statement in verse 16 that I want to draw your attention to. To the woman, God said, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Now, this has been interpreted in a few different ways. Some think that when it says that the woman's desire shall be for her husband, that it means despite the fact that you're going to have pain in childbearing, that the pregnancy and the childbearing and all of that stuff is going to be painful and, come with a lot of, uncomfortable things, and you're still going to be physically attracted to your husband. So you're still going to enter into all that because you're still desiring your husband. Now that works as far as picking up the second part of the verse from the first, but it's not a very good understanding of the verse as a whole. Chapter 4 actually helps us to understand what's going on here. One of the rules in biblical interpretation is you use the clear text to help you with the more difficult text. And in chapter 4, we see the same language being used between Cain and sin. You remember Cain was jealous because both he and Abel offered offerings to God, sacrifices to God, and Abel's was acceptable to God because the descriptions of his offering is that he gave God his very best. He gave him the fatty portions, which are supposed to be the best portions. So he didn't give God just some, he gave him the very best from his flock. Whereas the description of Cain is that he gave some. Some probably meaning some of the leftovers, what he didn't need or want, or what he was, no problem departing with this. One gave his best, one just gave out of duty. And so really it's the heart that's the problem. Abel gave out of love for God, and Cain gave because he had to. God responds because when God rejects his offering, and by the way, as a side note, it's not because one is a blood offering and the other isn't. The term for offering that's used here is a word that normally means a grain offering. So nowhere in the text are we told that the problem was that it wasn't blood. Okay, in fact, in Hebrews 11, it says, by faith he offered a better offering. One gave out of faith, one gave out of love, and the other gave without faith, without love. One gave the best, one gave what was left over. So it says that God had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering, he didn't. So Cain was very angry and his face fell. This is Genesis 4, verse 5. The Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? In other words, blame yourself. And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. The language is of a predator. Think of a lion or something that is in wait and looking to pounce and devour the prey. So this is sin. Sin is lying in wait, looking to devour, to destroy, to kill. So it says here that sin is crouching and waiting at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must rule over it. Desire and rule are the same two words that are used in chapter 3, where it says that the woman's desire would be for her husband and the husband would rule over her. In light of chapter 4, I think by far the best interpretation of chapter 3, verse 16, is that the conflict that was introduced by sin is that the woman, her desire now is to dominate, to domineer her husband. This sinful desire in her is to relate to her husband in a sinful way. But what's going to happen? Is the husband going to then just lovingly respond to the wife in her sin? No, he's going to dominate her. As one writer says, here we have the introduction of the battle of the sexes. What God designed as his perfect ideal for humanity is now the center of conflict. What was supposed to be the most loving, intimate relationship is now ground zero. According to one scholar, the woman will have an excessive desire and determination to dominate her husband. The man, however, will dominate her. In other words, there is nothing good in the second part of verse 16. Nothing good. Not only is the woman going to do evil, so is the man. Sin dramatically and drastically affects marriage relationships. In fact, we would say it affects every relationship, but the most intimate one is completely undermined by sin. And this is why we read about the speck and the log. Because unless we see clearly that not only our spouse's sin will undermine our marriage, but our own. Paul makes it very clear that we deal with three enemies: the world, the flesh, and the devil. And in the case of marriage, there's two fleshes, yours and your spouse. And so you have four enemies in every marriage. You have the demonic realm, which doesn't want God's ideal to be lived out and therefore God be glorified and honored in it, but wants to undermine it. We have the world and its influence upon marriage. If you look at television programs or such and how they view marriage nowadays, It's the opposite of what the Bible says. The nuclear family is constantly under attack. And so we have the perversion of the world. But we also have the sin of the husband and the sin of the wife. So marriage, from a biblical perspective, is like the proverbial salmon trying to swim up the waterfall. In fact, it is much worse than that. It's an impossible task apart from the grace of God. Apart from God being very active in a marriage, it's going to be assaulted day and night. Marriage as it exists after the fall is by its very nature a sinful battle of selfish wills. Let's be very clear at this point. God has given us over to our sin, measure for measure, as one scholar puts it, to the misery of competition. And by there, it's not a one-upmanship. It is a competition for satisfaction of my own personal felt needs. Furthermore, just as Adam blamed God and Eve blamed the serpent, our fallen tendency is to pass blame upon others. Therefore, as we look at the duties and the instructions that God gives for husbands and wives, it's important that we follow the biblical pattern of looking at ourselves. The Bible clearly teaches that we are to take responsibility for how we live, how we obey God's pattern for ourselves. It is not to focus on the other. It's not putting on blame, but taking personal responsibility for our own actions and choices. I believe it's God's business to change someone's heart. And God may use us to do that. But God always puts the priorities of self-examination and making sure that we ourselves are pursuing God's ideal in living a holy, righteous, blameless life. Okay, let's begin with the duties of husbands. The husband's duties in returning to God's ordained pattern is outlined principally in 3 passages. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 25 through 33, which is paralleled in Colossians 3, verse 19, and in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7. The husband, first and foremost, is commanded to love his wife. To love his wife. This is seen in Ephesians 5, verse 25, verse 28, verse 33, Colossians 3, verse 19. So it is repeated over and over again that the husband is to love his wife. Now, in the first century Greco-Roman context, you would never find statements arguing that a husband should love his wife. What you would find is that the husband should rule over, should dominate his wife. That's how the pagan world viewed the marriage relationship, that the husband was to wield authority over his wife. Remember, Jesus talks about this. Don't be like the pagans who lord it over those in authority under them. So the pagan would say that the husband should lord it over his wife. But the Bible doesn't say that. It says that the husband is to love his wife. Now, it doesn't define the word love here as far as saying love and it means this. What it does is it goes on and explains the degree or the extent of love that Paul has in mind. So turn just for a second to Ephesians chapter 5, which is the key text in the Bible on the roles of husband and wife. Verse 25. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Well, if Christ's relationship to the church, which was purchased by his blood, that we were redeemed at a cost, the cost of his own life, and not merely the physical death, but also when he was the propitiation for our sins and the wrath of God was placed upon him. An unimaginable love. Not only the love of the Father, but the love of the Son. In this is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins, John tells us. You want to know what love is? Look at the cross. So in looking at the cross and what God did for us sinners, Paul says that there is an analogy between the love of Christ for us and the love of the husband for his wife. So it's not some sort of superficial or warm fuzzy feeling type of love. It is the most in-depth love imaginable. So he says, husbands, love your wives, and this is the kind of love that I want you to have. Now, it would be merely a truism to say, husbands, love your wife, and just leave it there, because Christ has already been very emphatic that we're to love all people. He says, as I have loved you, so love one another. A new command I give you, love one another. This same Christ says that you are to love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. So it's a mere truism to say that we are to love other people. But here he centers out the husband, and what we're going to find from Titus, and you would also find this in places like Galatians 5, is that love is not natural. Okay, there's an affection which can be natural. Okay, so boy meets girl. They have affection for each other. They may call it love, but it's affection. There's a natural love that often has between, especially a mother and her child. We even see this in the animal realm. You know, when you see bear cubs, they always warn you, be careful, because the mama bear may be around and she will do anything to protect her cubs. There's something ingrained in especially women that God has created, that there's this bond, this affection that's there. But the biblical definition of love, it transcends that. It is not natural, it is supernatural. Now we'll come back to this. But the emphasis here is in contrast to what the pagan world says, the secular world says, where it does not talk about a husband loving his wife, but ruling over her, using her. He says, husbands, love your wives and love them just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. This doesn't mean merely be willing to die for your wife. I know some people that in practical sense, they're walking down a busy street. They make sure when they're walking on the sidewalk that they're on the roadside. The wife is on the other side. So if the car comes, they're between the car and their wife. Okay? That's great. But there's a lot of people, and I've heard this saying before, there's a lot of men who would willingly die for their wife, but they won't live for them. And I think it's true of our relationship with Christ too. Remember, our theme for this year is living for Christ, living for Jesus, living for God. A lot of people would gladly be martyred for their faith, but they won't live day to day for God. So here when he says, just as Christ gave himself up, yes, you should be willing to die for your wife. But more importantly, it means you should be willing to live for your wife. Do what is necessary for your wife. Christ didn't just die. He died with a purpose to give life. So he repeats this 2 more times in this section about husbands loving his wife. So verse 28, he says, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it. Okay, this is verse 29. He says, husbands, love your wife. Love them as your own body. He who loves his wife loves himself. So the general idea here is, unless you have some sort of mental disorder, people generally will love themselves in the sense of taking care of themselves. You'll feed yourself. You'll clothe yourselves. You'll get medical attention, whatever. And so he says, if people are doing that, you should be doing that and more for your wife. Love them like you love yourself. Remember, he says, love your neighbor as yourself. Same general principle there. Probably a bit of the golden rule in there too, do unto others, you would have them do unto you. Okay, and then finally verse 33, let each one of you love his wife as himself. So, husbands are told over and over and over again that they must love their wives. Again, this one will come up with the wives, so we'll come back to it. Let's move on here quickly. The other passage is 1 Peter 3, verse 7. 1 Peter 3, verse 7, likewise, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as the weaker vessel, since they are heirs with you of the grace of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Okay, there's several things in here, but just for the sake of time, he says, live or conduct yourself in your relationship with your wife in an understanding way. Now, this understanding way is in relationship on the vertical level between you and God, and on the horizontal level between you and your wife. Literally, when it says understanding way, it should be translated, live according to knowledge. And it refers here, first and foremost, to the husband's relationship with God. Your relationship with your wife should be on the basis of your knowledge of God. What his will is for your marriage, what his instructions are for you as a husband. Husbands should relate to their wives informed by the knowledge of God's will, what he demands of them. So this would include love, which we've already seen was commanded by God, to love your wives. So God's will for us is to love our wives. And by the way, you'll notice there in the Ephesians passage that there are no conditions attached to the wife as far as receiving love from her husband. It doesn't say love your wife as long as. It says love your wife. There are no out clauses. There are no circumstances where it doesn't apply. In fact, we all know that love, biblically defined, is difficult. And so love must be an exercise of the will to choose to do this. And we'll see 1 Corinthians 13 will help us with this. On the horizontal, it means knowledge of the wife. And Wayne Grudem points out in his commentary on 1 Peter that it has to do with the knowledge of the wife's desires, her goals, her needs, her frustrations, her strengths, her weaknesses. You need to know your wife so that you can minister to your wife and her neediness. And I think as husbands, this is our weakest point here. All of us know that men and women are different. That's why John Gray could write that men are from Mars and women are from Venus. We're from two different planets. We're nothing alike. And so it's important for us men to pay attention. And we're not good at that at all. We seem to think that women should be like us. They should act like us. They should think like us. Emotionally, they should be like us. And by the way, I would argue that the reverse is true as well. That women expect men to think like them, to behave like them, to be emotional like them, all that. But we're so different. And we need to understand this. God made us different as a strength. But we need to see the differences in one another in order that we might relate properly to one another. So he says, live with your wife with the knowledge of what God demands of you and what your wife's needs are. Showing honor to the woman. This is a great term. It means showing esteem, reverence, honor. It's putting your wife on a pedestal as far as being a treasured possession. Showing esteem to them. By the way, I like that rendering because it has the idea of demonstrating that she does have worth to you. Somebody can say they love you and then completely undermine it by their actions. Somebody can say that they're sorry and they completely undermine it by their action. They don't demonstrate they were sorry. So showing esteem here means living with your wife in a way that she sees that you esteem her, that you honor, that you value her. And it's not merely with your lips. Some people hate Valentine's Day because their Valentine treats them like garbage 364 days a year and then gives them chocolate and flowers and a nice card on Valentine's Day. So how does that undo the others? There are people that hate Mother's Day and Father's Day because the same thing happens. So here it is regularly, habitually living with your wife in a way that you show that she is of value to you. In a practical sense, it refers to a recognition of your wife as an equal co-heir of the riches of Christ through salvation and as a God-given complement. It is to honor your wife as God's special gift to you. Now, those are the duties for men. To live with in an understanding way, to honor, and to love. The wife, on the other hand, has different duties. Ephesians chapter 5 says in particular that the wife is to submit to her husband. Now, this is not popular teaching in our modern world. Even among evangelical Christians, they want to change the meaning of all this. And there's much to say here, and I'm going to say a few points. But what some have tried to do is flatten this verse. Okay, flatten the passage and basically divest it of any meaning in regard to authority or actual submission. Because look at verse 21 of Ephesians 5. There it says, look at the very ending, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. Okay, so it's mutual submission then, submitting to one another. So it must mean that the husband submits to the wife and the wife the husband. And so they reinterpret this word, submit, and they mean it to be kind to one another, to be favorable to one another, and give it meaning it doesn't have anywhere else. By the way, you can't make words mean what they don't mean. Words have a range of meaning. And the word that's used here, hupotasso, it only means submitting to someone in authority over you. That is a contradiction in terms to say that the husband and wife both submit to each other. It's like saying, well, the husband is in authority over me, but I'm in authority over him. That's nonsense. That's a nonsense statement. The word hupotasso has to mean to come under the authority. It means to subordinate, to subjugate. Now here, it's the wife must submit herself. The husband can't force her to submit. God tells her that she needs to submit. Now, before moving on, just a couple of more points about why mutual submission is not what the text is talking about at all. Okay, it says that the husband submits to Christ. Can you think of any conceivable way that Christ submits to the husband? Or that the church submits, or that Christ submits to the church? Nobody would argue for that. Keep reading. It talks about children submitting to their parents. So mutual submission, so then parents submit to their children? Or then it goes on and talks about slaves and their masters. In what sense does a master submit to his slave? Nowhere in the Bible are we told that husbands submit to their wives, nor are we told that parents submit to children, nor are we told that masters submit to their slaves. It doesn't work that way. Now, one other problem that people bring into this is they think, well, it says one another, which is one word in Greek, and they think that it must mean all to all, everyone to everyone. They forget there's a whole bunch of times in the Bible where it means some to others. So when it says submit to one another, here it's some to others. How does it work? Husbands submit to Christ. The church submits to Christ. Wives to husbands. Children to parents. Slaves to masters. Okay? Everybody except God the Father submits to somebody. And so each is called to submit to the one who is in authority over them. So when we go on reading and we see several times, now, the wife being told to submit is found in Ephesians 5:22-24, Colossians 3:18, Titus 2, verse 5, 1 Peter 3, verse 1, and verse 5. It's repeated over and over and over again, driving home a point. Now, this is telling us, now how this works out in the dynamics of the husband-wife relationship is not entirely clear, but we are told here that the woman is under the authority of her husband. Not all husbands, her husband. Okay, there's a little word that's put in there, her own husband. But it is a legitimate authority. And it's only not in just certain areas of the relationship, because Paul says in every way or in everything. Look at Ephesians 5, verse 24. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives submit in everything to their husbands. Your relationship is one where in everything the woman relates to the husband as one under the authority of her husband. In everything. In everything except sin. If a husband is calling a wife to sin, then she is to obey God rather than her husband. But Paul is very clear. The wife is to submit to her husband in everything. 1 Peter 3, 1 through 5 is helpful here. It focuses on the wife's godly character. So there where it tells us twice that the wife is to submit to her husband, okay? Wives, be subject to your own husbands. Verse 5, for this is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves by submitting to their own husbands. It tells us how to submit. And the primary way in which a woman submits to her husband it's not by being a doormat. It's by living a godly life. Notice what it says. When you see they see your respectful and pure conduct, 1 Peter 3, 2. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very present. This is how the holy women who hoped in God used to adorn themselves by submitting to their own husbands. How does a woman submit to her own husband? Primarily through her godly character. It does not negate the concept of authority, because he uses another term. He says the husband is the head, kephale, of the wife. And the word head, when it's not used of an anatomical body part, refers to authority. The husband is the head of the wife. So the way that the wife submits to her husband is through a godly life. The wife's influence on her husband is to be through exhibition of pure conduct. In here, it even talks about if it's an unbelieving husband, he may be led to the Lord through her godly conduct, which we see elsewhere as well. That Paul talks about that. One scholar said it this way: instead of nagging, criticizing, and preaching to her husband, a wife should set a godly example before him, showing him the power and beauty of the gospel through its effect in her own life. There was a story I came across years and years ago about a woman who was married to a police officer who was not a Christian, and he was not a very nice man. He was just rough, very rough. Probably made him a good police officer, but he was rough. He was rough with his wife, with his family. He was hard to live with. And their marriage was just in tatters. But in coming to study what the Bible said about the role of the wife and what she was supposed to do, she said out of love for Jesus, because at this point she didn't love her husband. Okay? And the danger of not loving your spouse is it colors everything. When you have hostile feelings towards your spouse, scholars and experts tell us the husband, the wife cannot do right in your eyes anymore. Everything is colored by your view of them. So even if they do something good, it's tainted. You won't see it as good. Everything becomes bad. So this teaching opened up her eyes to the thought. She says, listen, I need to make sure I'm doing what God says, and I'll leave my husband in God's hands. But it's not going to be me that's going to dismantle our relationship. I'm going to do what God says. So she determined to love her husband, to honor him, to respect him, to submit to her authority. And I'm not saying this is a guarantee, but through her godly example, this man came to know Christ, and God completely changed him and changed their relationship. And she attributes it to the power of God in work in him by her not trying to change her husband, but changing herself. And that's what submission emphasizes. Live a godly life under the God-given authority of your husband. You take care of you. It also says in chapter 5, verse 3, so we have submission, then we have respect. The wife, we are told in Ephesians 5:33, is to respect her husband. So we already saw that the husband is to esteem or honor his wife, but also the wife is to honor, esteem, revere, respect her husband. By the way, in the context, the respect is not something that is earned, it's commanded. Okay, there's no situation. You may not respect something that is done, but you are to respect the husband as the one that God has given to you and the one who God has placed in authority over you. Wives must love their husbands. They must respect them, esteem them. And what you're doing really is you're respecting the role. This respect is not something to be earned, but is commanded by God to be given to the husband by virtue of his role. Okay, often in our culture we talk about respect is earned. You tell children you honor, you respect your mom, your dad, because God tells you to do it. In that case, it's not do it if they've earned your respect. And it's the same thing here. A woman is commanded by God to do this, and not if. One writer said it this way: a wise wife will never put her husband down or laugh at him, but will greatly strengthen him and build him up for God's glory. I like to describe marriage as building one building. And you don't tear it down while you're building it. So if a husband attacks his wife, he's attacking himself because they're one flesh. There's one building. There's one life that's being built, and vice versa. So we need to build, edify, not destroy. Finally, the woman is told to love the husband as well, and it's in Titus 2:4, where it says that train the younger women to love their husbands. This tells us, by the way, and it says, and their children. So the love that the Bible describes is not a natural love, but a supernatural one. And you need to be trained in this love. You need to learn it and to do it. So it's not talking about affection. It's talking about a biblically defined love. And here, women need to be trained to do it. A wife needs to be trained how to love her husband. It will not come naturally. Now, just in closing, I just want to point your attention to 1 Corinthians 13. This is the famous love passage. Now, you need to understand the context. It's smack between chapters 12 and 14, which have to do with spiritual gifts. So this is in the context of dealing with spiritual gifts. But it's biblically defined love, and so it's applicable in every circumstance. Not everything fits exactly with the husband-wife dynamic, but there's certain things here that I, as a husband, need to really look closely at, and every husband and every wife needs to as well. I'll point out a few things. Study this passage on your own, but one of the things you need to learn about grammatically is when he says love is patient, for instance, he doesn't use an adjective there. He uses a verb, which grammatically is strange. And he does that all the way through. There's 15 verbs he uses. And the emphasis is because love is something to be done. The emphasis on the doing. What it looks like, what it doesn't look like. Furthermore, all of these are attributes of God. And so when we act this way, we're acting like God. Love is patient. I'm just going to pick out a couple of them. The word patient here is not something where we're just kind of a little bit steadfast in a difficult circumstance. This word here that's used emphasizes a really bad circumstances. It's holding up under a very difficult circumstance. So things may be miserable for you in your circumstance, but true love holds up underneath that. It bears the weight of that. So it's not merely patience waiting out a circumstance. It has to do with bearing up under a difficult load. Okay, love is kind. It exemplifies kindness towards others. It lavishes kindness. It does not envy or boast. This has much more to do with the Corinthian situation where people were very arrogant about the spiritual gifts they were having, especially those with the more showy gifts, tongues and these sorts of things. But envy and boast are kind of two sides of the same thing. Envying has to do with, it could have two different connotations, but it can have wanting what you don't have, or it can mean not wanting somebody to have something that you don't have. So it's not merely that, well, they got a nice new car, I want that car. Envying could be, I don't want them to have that new car either. So in that case, it's not just wanting what they have, but it's wanting ill on them, wishing ill on them. Boasting is lording over people or holding over people what you have. Boasting on what you have, being arrogant about what you have. Now, in the marriage context, these sorts of things might be the more of the one-upmanship. It's sad, but in certain relationships, spouses, they almost rejoice when something bad or negative happens to the other. And that's not true. Rude has to do with how you treat someone. And the English here, it would be the same as the Greek. Treating somebody rudely, with bad manners. Okay? And we're all guilty of this. I'm guilty of this, of rudeness. And the person that I'm probably the rudest toward is my wife. There's an axiom that people often talk about is the person they love the most is probably the person that they treat the worst, at least at times. Okay, it does not insist on its own way. Compromise is a wonderful word in marriage. Okay, you don't have to insist everything my way. It's what is best is the idea. If we're building one life, what is best? By the way, this is negative, so it doesn't mean that there aren't certain situations where you insist on your own way because you don't see any other way and you believe it's the best way, and to go contrary to that is to invite disaster. But this is talking about an attitude of the heart. Remember, I mentioned near the beginning that we battle against the world. The world tells you, do what's best for you, your needs. And this is contrary to that. K is not irritable or resentful, does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Okay, it's very important here where it talks about love keeps no records of wrong. Love forgets. By the way, keep no record of wrong uses literal accounting terminology. You keep the books because you're keeping a record. And the idea is not keeping a record of what has happened in the past so that you have it available to bring it up and use it against them. Love doesn't use past mistakes, past hurts as a club to beat the other with. That's not love. And thank God he doesn't treat us that way. And so when it talks about love keeps no records of wrong, I think this is really important. Love forgives. Love covers a multitude of sins. Okay, let's just bring this to a close. The duties of husbands is primarily to love. Yes, the wife is to love their husband, but it's really, really singled out for the man that this is to be his main priority, to love his wife as Christ loved the church. It means to protect her, to provide for her, to nourish her, to cherish her. And all of this is completely unnatural. What is the first fruit of the Spirit? Love. And so husbands, we need to pray that God would help us to love our wives the way that Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. We need to make sure that we are esteeming our wives, that we are holding them with great affection and seeing them as worthy of respect and to be highly prized and valued, to revere them as God's gift. By the way, in there where it talks about the weaker vessel, one of the connotations of weaker vessel has to do with the fact that God has demanded that they submit. So how the husband loves his wife and esteems her is by not using his authority in a way that undermines her, that puts her down, or that doesn't treat her with esteem. We need to understand them, to know them, and to relate to them on that level. Wives also need to submit, to respect, and to love their husbands. So the Bible doesn't talk about, who looks after the finances, who does the banking, who pays the bills. It doesn't answer those questions. It answers the heart questions. And if we live and relate to each other by looking at the responsibilities God has given husbands and then as wives, rather than seeing, how can I fix my spouse? And so let's do some self-examination. Let's get the log out of our own eye so then we can help get the speck out of the eye of the other. Okay, these are eternal principles and truths that each of us need to implement. And may God help us do so.